There's a specific moment, identifiable and consistent across nearly every narcissist's life, that marks the actual beginning of a collapse most people assume happens gradually, randomly, or through some kind of slow, inevitable decline. It doesn't work that way. There's a precise trigger, a single event that reliably sets the entire unraveling into motion, and once you understand what it actually is, you'll recognize why some narcissists seem to sail through decades without consequence, while others hit a wall they never see coming, all at once, seemingly out of nowhere. The trigger is this: the moment their supply of easy, uncritical admiration finally, permanently, dries up faster than they can replace it. Let's build up to why this specific moment matters so much more than any other possible turning point, because it isn't obvious at first why this, specifically, functions as the actual collapse mechanism, rather than something like aging, professional failure, or getting caught in a lie. Every one of those things can happen to a narcissist and produce, at most, a temporary setback, something they navigate, reframe, and recover from using exactly the tools that have always worked before. What they cannot navigate, reframe, or recover from using those same tools is a genuine structural shortage of the one resource their entire psychological system was built to require: a steady, replenishing stream of people willing to admire, validate, or emotionally orbit around them without requiring much in return. Here's why this specific resource matters more than almost anything else in a narcissist's life, and why its disappearance functions so differently than any other kind of setback. A narcissist's sense of self isn't internally generated the way it is for most people. It's assembled continuously, moment to moment, from external input, admiration, attention, deference, emotional reaction from other people. This means their entire psychological stability depends on maintaining a functioning supply chain, constantly replenished, because the internal reservoir that most people rely on to sustain themselves through difficult periods simply isn't available to them in the same way. When that supply chain is healthy, functioning, generously stocked with people willing to keep providing this resource, a narcissist can appear remarkably stable, confident, even genuinely successful for years, sometimes decades. The instability was always there, structurally, underneath the surface. It simply never had reason to become visible because the supply never actually ran short enough to reveal it. Let's talk about why this supply chain, robust as it can seem for years, eventually tends to fail, because understanding the mechanism of its failure explains why the collapse, when it finally happens, so often looks sudden and dramatic rather than gradual. The first reason the supply eventually fails: people who provide easy, uncritical admiration are disproportionately drawn from populations that are, by their nature, temporary. New acquaintances who haven't yet learned the pattern, younger people still impressed by confidence and charm, they haven't yet learned to distinguish from genuine substance. People going through their own vulnerable period who are more susceptible to a narcissist's specific brand of intense, flattering attention. Every one of these sources has a natural expiration date, because new acquaintances eventually become old acquaintances who've had time to notice the pattern. Younger people eventually mature and develop more sophisticated discernment, and people who were vulnerable during a specific period eventually move through that vulnerability and become less susceptible to exactly the dynamic that originally drew them in. This means a narcissist's supply chain isn't actually stable. It's constantly depleting, constantly requiring replacement, in a process that works fine as long as new sources keep arriving at roughly the same rate old ones expire. The collapse becomes visible specifically when this replacement rate finally falls behind depletion, which tends to happen for reasons that compound rather than occurring randomly. The second reason, reputational information over enough time, tends to spread and accumulate, gradually shrinking the pool of people willing to serve as new sources of supply in the first place. Early in a narcissist's adult life, their reputation within any given social circle is essentially blank. Nobody yet has direct experience or secondhand warning about the pattern, which means every new person they encounter is, functionally, a fresh, uncontaminated potential source. But relationships end, people talk, patterns get noticed and shared, And over enough years, in any sufficiently connected social or professional world, the pool of people who haven't yet heard some version of a cautionary account tends to shrink. This doesn't happen everywhere equally. Some narcissists successfully migrate between disconnected social worlds, professional fields, or even geographic locations specifically to keep accessing fresh, uncontaminated populations. But this migration itself requires ongoing effort and ongoing success, and it eventually runs into its own limits, whether through simple exhaustion of available fresh territory or through increasingly connected information networks that make total reputational reinvention harder with each passing decade. The third reason, and one of the more significant ones, age itself gradually narrows the population from which fresh admiration is naturally, easily drawn. Younger sources of supply, new romantic interests, junior colleagues, younger friends impressed by an older person's apparent confidence and success become harder to access as a narcissist ages, both because the pool of available younger people willing to orbit around an older person shrinks naturally over time, and because the specific charm that worked so effectively at one life stage often translates less effectively or reads very differently at a later one. What looked like confident magnetic charisma at 35 can start reading as something closer to desperate or slightly pathetic at 65, even though the underlying behavior hasn't actually changed, simply because the social context evaluating it has shifted. The fourth reason, a narcissist's own behavior over enough years tends to actively accelerate the depletion of their supply chain in a kind of self-reinforcing cycle that compounds the other three factors. Every relationship that ends badly, every discarded friend, every burned professional bridge, every family member who's finally, permanently stepped back, doesn't just remove one person from the available pool. It often removes that person's entire network as well, because people talk to their own friends and family about significant relationship endings, meaning each individual burned bridge tends to actually cost far more than a single relationship's worth of future supply. I want to walk through what actually happens once these four factors compound past a certain threshold, because this is where the collapse referenced in this episode's title actually begins to unfold, and it tends to follow a remarkably consistent pattern. The first visible sign: escalating effort required to secure the same level of supply that used to arrive easily. Where charm and minimal effort used to reliably attract admiration, a narcissist facing genuine supply depletion often finds themselves working much harder, more elaborate charm offensives, more frequent attempts at new connections, more visible, sometimes uncomfortably obvious efforts to secure validation that used to arrive without much effort at all. This escalation is often the first thing people around them start to notice, sometimes before the narcissist themselves fully registers what's happening. The second visible sign: increasing desperation in how existing relationships get managed, because with fewer fresh sources available, existing relationships suddenly carry more weight than they used to, producing behavior that looks, to people who've known this person for years, uncharacteristically anxious or clingy compared to the more confident, take-it-or-leave-it energy they used to project when supply was more abundant. The third visible sign, and often the most dramatic: a marked increase in erratic or extreme behavior as existing tactics that used to work reliably start failing more often, producing exactly the kind of escalation we discussed in earlier episodes about what happens when someone's usual strategies stop generating results. A narcissist facing genuine supply scarcity often cycles through their entire toolkit with increasing speed and increasing intensity, because each individual tactic is now failing faster than it used to, forcing a desperate progression through options that used to be deployed slowly, strategically, over much longer time frames. I want to say something important about why this entire process, once it begins compounding, tends to accelerate rather than stabilize into some kind of new, lower equilibrium. Each of the visible signs we just discussed, increased effort, increased desperation, increased erratic behavior, actively makes the underlying supply problem worse rather than better, because all three of these behaviors are, themselves, exactly the kind of pattern that accelerates reputational spread, drives away remaining sources of supply faster, and makes securing new sources even harder than it already was. This is why the collapse, once it genuinely begins, so often accelerates into something that looks, from the outside, sudden and catastrophic, even though the underlying supply depletion had actually been building slowly, invisibly, for years before it finally crossed the threshold where its effects became impossible to hide. And this is exactly where we're headed in the second half of this conversation. What this collapse actually looks like once it's fully underway, why some narcissists manage to delay or partially reverse it, while others never recover from it at all, and why understanding this entire mechanism matters far more for your own clarity and peace than it will ever matter for predicting or witnessing what eventually happens to anyone specific in your own life who fits this pattern. Let's talk about what this collapse actually looks like once it's fully underway, because the earlier signs we discussed in the first half, escalating effort, increasing desperation, erratic behavior, represent only the beginning stages. Once the underlying supply depletion crosses a certain threshold, the pattern tends to move into territory that's harder to reverse, and understanding this later stage explains why some narcissists genuinely never recover their earlier level of functioning, while others find ways to partially rebuild. Here's the first thing that tends to happen once collapse moves past its early stages: a narrowing, often dramatic, of the standards being applied to new sources of supply. Early in a narcissist's life, when the supply chain was healthy and abundant, there was room to be selective, choosing admiration specifically from people whose validation carried real social currency, real prestige, real value in whatever hierarchy mattered most to that particular person. As genuine scarcity sets in, this selectivity becomes a luxury the narcissist can no longer afford. They begin accepting supply from increasingly unlikely, increasingly lower status sources, people they would have previously dismissed as unworthy of their attention, relationships that would have once seemed beneath them, connections built on considerably less impressive foundations than what used to be the standard. This shift is often deeply uncomfortable for the narcissists themselves, though rarely acknowledged directly, because it represents a visible, undeniable decline in their own perceived status, forced upon them by circumstances rather than chosen freely. The second thing that tends to happen: a significant increase in what might be called supply cannibalization, extracting increasingly intense levels of validation from a shrinking pool of remaining sources, rather than successfully expanding that pool. This often manifests as intensified demands on whoever remains in the narcissist's orbit: family members, whatever friends haven't yet stepped back, romantic partners who haven't yet left. These remaining relationships get asked to provide more, emotionally, than they were ever asked to provide during the earlier, more abundant period, precisely because there are fewer alternative sources left to distribute those demands across. This intensification frequently accelerates the departure of exactly the people the narcissist most needs to retain, creating a vicious cycle where the increased demand for supply from a shrinking pool actively shrinks that pool further, faster than it would have shrunk on its own. The third thing that tends to happen, and one of the more psychologically significant developments, a marked increase in the narcissist's own internal distress becoming visible, sometimes for the first time in their adult life, in ways that are difficult for even skilled self-management to fully conceal. This connects directly to something we discussed in an earlier episode about the internal suffering that underlies narcissistic patterns from the very beginning. That underlying emptiness, that inability to generate lasting satisfaction from external achievement, has always been present. But during periods of abundant supply, it could be effectively managed, distracted from, kept below the surface through the constant, reliable stream of validation available to paper over it. As that supply genuinely dries up, the management strategy stops working as effectively, and the underlying distress that was always there starts becoming visible in ways it wasn't before. Increased anxiety, increased volatility, sometimes genuine depression, none of which the narcissist typically has effective tools to process, because processing genuine internal distress was never something their entire psychological architecture was built to do. I want to talk about what determines whether this collapse becomes permanent or whether some narcissists manage to at least partially rebuild, because this varies significantly and understanding the factors involved matters for accurate expectations rather than assuming every collapse follows an identical trajectory. The first factor, whether the narcissist has access to entirely new, uncontaminated populations to migrate toward a new city, a new industry, a new social world where their reputation hasn't yet preceded them. Narcissists with genuine resources, genuine mobility, and genuine willingness to relocate or reinvent themselves professionally sometimes successfully restart the entire supply chain in a fresh environment, effectively resetting the clock on the depletion process we described in the first half. This doesn't resolve the underlying pattern. The same cycle of eventual depletion will likely repeat in the new environment, on a similar though not necessarily identical timeline, but it can genuinely delay collapse, sometimes for years, sometimes even permanently, if the reinvention is successful enough and sustained carefully enough. The second factor, whether the narcissist happens to encounter and successfully attach to one or more individuals with an unusually high and unusually durable tolerance for providing exactly the kind of supply they need, without the typical erosion that eventually depletes most sources. This does happen more often than people expect. A specific partner, a specific family member, occasionally a specific professional relationship that continues providing validation and accommodation for far longer than would be typical, either due to their own psychological patterns, genuine unconditional love that persists despite mistreatment, or circumstances that make leaving genuinely difficult regardless of how depleted the relationship has become for them personally. When this happens, it can significantly delay the visible collapse we've described, sometimes for the remainder of the narcissist's life, though usually at enormous cost to whoever is providing this unusually durable, unusually tolerant supply. The third factor, and the one that actually determines whether genuine lasting recovery occurs rather than simply delay, whether the narcissist ever accesses real, sustained psychological treatment, specifically addressing the underlying pattern rather than simply finding new ways to manage its symptoms. This is genuinely rare. For reasons we've discussed in earlier episodes, the entire psychological architecture underlying this pattern makes the kind of honest self-examination required for genuine treatment extraordinarily difficult to access voluntarily, and the collapse itself, however painful, doesn't automatically produce the insight required to seek this kind of help. Some do eventually access it, particularly when the collapse becomes severe enough to threaten something they genuinely can't tolerate losing, and for this small percentage, genuine change and even meaningful recovery is possible. For the larger percentage, the pattern continues, in a permanently diminished, permanently more effortful form, without ever actually resolving the underlying cause. I want to say something important about why understanding this entire mechanism matters for your own clarity, particularly if you've watched someone in your own life move through some version of what we've described across both halves of this episode. This understanding was never meant to provide satisfaction about someone else's eventual struggles, and it was never meant to function as a prediction you should actively watch for, waiting to confirm that collapse has actually occurred in the specific case of someone who hurt you personally. What it's meant to provide is something more useful and more permanent, an accurate framework for understanding behavior that without this context can seem confusing, inconsistent, or difficult to make sense of, whether you're currently watching it unfold in someone's life, or whether you're simply trying to understand, retrospectively, patterns you witnessed in a relationship that's already ended. I want to leave you with an image because I think it captures everything we've walked through across both halves of this episode. Picture a fire, built not from wood that replenishes on its own, but from a stockpile that someone has been steadily, continuously feeding into it for years, never planting anything new, never cultivating a renewable source, simply drawing from an existing supply that seemed for a long time large enough that its eventual depletion felt like a distant, almost theoretical concern rather than an approaching reality. For years, this fire burns bright, warm, impressive to anyone standing nearby, giving no visible indication that anything about its fuel source is actually finite, actually diminishing, actually approaching a threshold that will eventually become impossible to ignore. And then, gradually, the fire's tender starts reaching further and further for each new log, the stockpile visibly thinning in ways it never used to, requiring more effort, more searching, more desperate scavenging to keep the flame at the same height it used to maintain with minimal, almost effortless upkeep. For a while, this increased effort manages to disguise the underlying problem, the fire still burning, still impressive from a distance, even as the search for fuel becomes increasingly frantic behind the scenes. But a fire fed only from a depleting stockpile, with no renewable source ever cultivated alongside it, eventually reaches a point where no amount of increased effort can outpace the actual rate of depletion. The flame begins to shrink, not gradually and gracefully, but often suddenly, dramatically, once the gap between what's being consumed and what remains finally becomes too large to bridge through effort alone. What was once a bright, impressive, warm fire becomes something smaller, more erratic, requiring constant, exhausting tending just to maintain even a fraction of its former height. The tragedy here was never really about the fire itself, however impressive it once appeared. It was about the absence, from the very beginning, of anything renewable underneath it. No planted forest, no sustainable source, nothing capable of actually replenishing itself the way a fire fed by genuine, cultivated growth eventually can. And the person who built that fire this way, drawing endlessly from a finite stockpile without ever once considering what would happen when it finally ran low, is left, eventually, standing beside diminishing flames, searching increasingly desperately for fuel that was never actually going to be there in the quantities the fire had always required. You were never responsible for keeping that fire burning. You were never obligated to keep offering yourself as fuel for a flame that was always, from its very first spark, going to eventually run out of everything except what it could take from someone else.